Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'll be talking about this camera right here. It's the original Canon 5D Classic. This camera is legendary in terms of color science and also like bringing the budget full frame into the market. And of course nowadays that you can't really find it brand new anymore, the budget becomes even cheaper. That being said, this camera is still very capable, especially if you want to focus into photography and nothing related to filmmaking, of course. And in this video, I'll be sharing with you my thoughts, the pros, the cons, based on my experience, the way I shoot with this camera. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS 5D Classic. Now this camera came out a long time ago, and even nowadays it's still very famous for its reliability and its color science. And after using it for a couple of months now, I can really see where they're coming from. This camera has never let me down. The battery life is great, especially it's a very simple camera, photography oriented camera, so it doesn't actually need a lot of battery life anyway. You're mainly just looking through the viewfinder. The color science is great, whether you're actually shooting in RAW or JPEG. Of course, the dynamic range is not really the best of its class, especially for today's standards, but it actually will get the job done. And to be honest, for most job, it will actually have enough dynamic range anyway. And in this video, I'll be covering the pros and the cons for both ergonomics, the operational side of things, and then going to the image quality and pretty much ending the video with my conclusion, what I think about it, and actually why I'm recommending this camera even for today. So the operational side and the ergonomics of this camera is really great. This camera is built like a tank. It's still tough. It's made out of magnesium alloy. You might think that it's actually very similar to the 5D Mark II. It is kind of similar in terms of appearance, but the 5D Mark II is kind of more angular, has a matte finish. I think the top buttons has more logically arranged buttons versus the button layout up here, but the rest of the body is kind of very similar, just a smaller screen, and that's about it. The storage on this camera is quite convenient. It only takes one CF card, but these CF cards can be found for a very low price nowadays, simply because they're quite old. You can get like one of those 30 megabit per second cards, and you can actually put it in this camera. And because the resolution on this camera is nowhere near as high as, let's say, the 5D Mark II, the 5D Mark IV, things like that, you can easily get a lot of images in one, let's say, 16 gigabyte card. Another nice thing about this camera is the grip. The grip is really nice. If you're used to the 20D, 30D, 40D, 50D, it pretty much has the same grip. There's a little bit of indent here, which I like more, but that's a very minor detail. I personally like the grip of this camera more than the grip of the 5D Mark II, but it's just a really tiny little detail in there, which most people will not notice. And if you're wearing gloves in winter, you will definitely not notice that. So yeah, but otherwise, all the button layout and everything here are quite nice. And as mentioned before, because this is a photography only camera, there are not a lot of buttons to really figure out. And a lot of buttons here are pretty much just straightforward buttons that you can just access without just accessing the main menus. So it's just really quick. You can just press on any button for your general settings for photography, and that's actually quite nice and handy. Another thing that I really like, this is really nitpicking, but I really like the sound of the dial. This is like the sound of the original dial that came with the 5D Mark II as well, but after like using it for a while, the 5D Mark II's dial turns into this sound, which sounds very loud and tacky. And at first I thought it was just my 5D Mark II, but after renting other 5D Mark IIs at the time of when I was still using this camera for like full-time professional use, yeah, this is a very common kind of dial sound after you use it for a while. And it's good to see that after a while the dial sound doesn't really change, but that's just me nitpicking, and it's just a little thing I noticed that only happens with the 5D Mark II, but doesn't happen with the 5D Mark III, Mark IV, or the original 5D Classic. So yeah, that's just something that I noticed. And talking about how most of the buttons here are logically arranged, I would just like to shortly touch upon the menu system. The menu system on this camera is great. Yes, it's simply because it doesn't have a lot of features to boast about. It's mainly just a photography camera, but that's just great simply because this actually allows you to really focus on the shots more, because having the menu just logically arranged, nothing like fancy feature to really bother you or just distract you away from the shots, just makes you just want to focus on the shot, focus on the scene, focus on the story or the storytelling part even more. So let's say you're doing street photography, documentary photography, or documenting even your kids or your friends' birthday party, or yeah, some sort of events. You know, just having a very simple camera like this allows you to just focus on the scene and just access just the most essential features and functions of the camera, as well as settings of the camera, and just, yeah, shoot and just focus on the scene. And that is something I really, really like, and I really enjoy using this camera just because of that, compared to, you know, something like even the 5D Mark II or even my R5 in the background. And yeah, it's a really nice thing that until you really use it, you don't really know, but once you experience it, you will appreciate it. And the next point is the autofocusing system. Now, this only has like a 9-point autofocusing system, and to be honest, that's totally okay. If you're just focusing on street photography, portraits, general landscape photography, general event photography, I think the autofocusing system will do the job. It will not be as, you know, snappy as something like the R5, the R6, or even the EOS R, but it will really get the job done. Personally, I love using the autofocusing system on this camera for the same reason as using the menu settings and everything. It's just so simple. It only has 9 points, and of course, they're not lightning fast, but they're really fast. And you can really rely on them if you know its limitation and its sensitivity, of course. And obviously this will take time, but once you get used to the sensitivity of the AF points, you will just know where to frame and how to frame and when to hit that shutter button, or when to predict, how to predict certain things in your frame, things like that. Then obviously you will be able to work together with the autofocusing system just fine. And the 9-point AF on this camera is pretty much not obtruding the rule of thirds, so you can pretty much use the rule of third together with the autofocusing points just fine. So you're not just gonna be, you know, unbalancing the camera or unbalancing the composition or anything. It will just work just fine. So yeah, I really have no problem with it, and I understand why there are a lot of complaints towards it, but honestly, if you're just sticking with the essentials, I think that it's more than good enough of an autofocusing system, to be honest with you. But of course, just like the frame rates, if you're looking for something that's, you know, going to be photographing sports, wildlife, things like that, something that's really fast action, then this camera is not really for you. Can you get the job done? Yes, you can, but it will take some time and some practice for sure. But otherwise, this is a very simple, very tough camera to use. That's also weather sealed. I don't know if you can see it down here, but you know, it's been scratched by the previous owner so many times, and it's just, you know, goes to prove how tough these bodies really are. And yeah, it's just showing the original color of the magnesium alloy. And now onto the image quality. Now, I don't really have a lot to say about the image quality on this camera, simply because it is great. As I mentioned earlier, it's just not the best when it comes to dynamic range, but for general purpose, like if you're just taking pictures of landscape, whether it's sunrise or sunset, I think the color science is great. Yes, you will not see as much detail in the sun as, let's say, the more modern sensors, but you know, if you know what you're doing, it's still a superb camera, and you still can recover a lot of details with this camera, to be honest with you. And the color science of this camera is just great. Will you see moire and aliasing? I think you will still see moire and aliasing when you actually focus a lot of fine patterns, but it's not as bad, you know. You will be able to get out of it, and it's not every day that you'll be photographing a lot of fine patterns, you know. So yeah, that's something to think about. If you photograph a lot of fine patterns, it may not be for you, but if you're a type of person who just photograph general things and just maybe do some session with portraits here, do some weddings there, do some event photography and landscape photography, then this camera is definitely a really good camera that still delivers really great image quality. Of course, the downside on this camera is the low light performance, especially the sensitivity of the ISO. I wouldn't really trust this camera higher than 800 ISO for professional work. Anything with personal work, I think using ISO 1000 or 1250 is just okay with this camera, but I wouldn't really push it. If you push it to 1600 ISO, I think it's still okay as long as if you don't really edit the images. Otherwise, the images could easily fall apart unless if all you're doing is just, you know, recovering the highlights. Again, I really love the color signs, how the camera render the skin tones, how the camera render the darkness to brightness that is not really choppy. You know, if you take a look at the earlier Sony full frame cameras, how it renders from highlights to shadows, it's a little bit choppy, and this is actually very, very natural, and it actually says a lot about the capability of this camera. And you know, for again, this is 150 euros. You can't really go wrong. You have a lot of toy cameras that will deliver really crappy results at 150 euros or even more, and to get this for about 150 euros or 170 euros, depending on where you live, obviously the price fluctuates a little bit. Yes, you can also get it cheaper depending on where you live. Again, you can't really go wrong with this camera, and investing a little bit more on the glass will actually just give you some superb images. I highly recommend the 50mm f1.8 STM. It's actually a much sharper lens than this one, but to me, aperture matters more, and I got the 1.4 for this one. So yeah. And the last point that can't really be ignored is the resolution of this camera. Yes, it's only 12 megapixels. We live in a generation where we have a lot of smartphones that goes over 42 or 48 megapixels nowadays, and heck, my R5 goes over 40 megapixels. And of course, to a lot of people, especially beginners, might think that 12 megapixels is just very, very small resolution. Now, if we take a look at 4K video, it's actually approximately 8 megapixels, and a lot of people just goes, wow, it's just full of detail and everything, and it just makes the image come to life. Well, it's only around 8 megapixels, 8-ish megapixels, and if you can see that as coming into life, 12 megapixels shouldn't really be a huge downgrade, right? And also, if you take a look at Instagram, social media in general, they use pretty much less than 2 megapixels of image to really upload their images. So even with 12 megapixels, you are still able to just crop a ton and still have enough resolution to just post on social media if that's what you're doing. And with 12 megapixels, it's still more than enough to make really detailed A3 or even A2 prints. And yeah, I wouldn't really comment or complain too much about the 12 megapixels being too low, unless if, you know, you're really printing to a billboard size and just putting it on like your wall. So yeah, I wouldn't really complain. Of course, we live in a day where people just store digital files on their phones and not really printing out images. So when people just store digital files on their phones or onto their big monitor computers, then they tend to zoom in a little bit and they start seeing noise or pixelation. Now, of course, modern monitors like 5K monitors has a ton of details in them, and if you just want to zoom into like one specific point of an image, of course you will see pixelations and noise in the image and everything, and it's just not fair to really grade or judge the images out of this camera that way. You know, you also have to think about the fact that zooming in that much, or the resolution of your screen, how much you want to crop in, you know, like you're just really nitpicking on the actual detail. Whereas if you just want to look at the overall image, on how good it looks, the color rendition, the color science of it, and also the actual composition of your photograph, I think those things matters way more than just, you know, pixel peeping into the picture and just not realizing how far you've zoomed in or how far you've cropped in. So yeah, just to keep that in mind. Now onto my conclusion. As mentioned earlier in the video, I really have positive feelings towards this camera. I absolutely love and enjoy using this camera. I still keep it and also keep my 5D Mark II simply because there are two really classic cameras that I really love love going out and just shoot with, whether in RAW or JPEG. They just deliver really unique looking images, especially color science coming out of these cameras. You know, it's just that nostalgic feeling with the digital sensor that you don't really get nowadays with the more modern digital sensors. So it's just a nice nostalgic kind of digital look, if you want, that will just bring you back to a certain time period, so to speak. And of course, if you want to tweak the images, it's actually very easy. The files are very light and yet still remain a lot of detail in it. So it's really, really nice. And for the price, again, it's only between 150 to 170 euros, give or take, depending on where you live. It's just, you know, not really hard to go wrong for. If you don't like it, you still can sell it for pretty much the same price as you got it, sometimes even higher, and that's pretty good. And now to the last point, which is the point that I've been repeating quite a few times. It's just a really restrictive photography camera. It's really only stripped down to its core essential as a photography camera. So it really allows you to just focus on the framing, on the storytelling, on what's going on in front of you, on your creation. It's just a very simple camera, and that's it. It's not distracting in any way. It's not trying to distract you. It's just a part of you when you're using it. And that's something that you can really appreciate when using this camera. And it's just something that you can't really get with, you know, something like the 5D Mark II or even the R5. It's something to, appreciate for. And it's just really fun taking this camera out and just taking pictures. Not only that I'm just focusing on the scene and the story and the documentary of it, I am actually just, you know, not mind that this camera is just part of me. So yeah, there's nothing to distract me. And with that, I would just like to leave it here. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description section below. It's absolutely for free. No need to submit your email address, nothing, just click and download. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.